Thank you everyone for coming. Good afternoon. My name is Ben Watkins. I'm a product marketing lead here at Asana, and I'm excited to share today's session around turning strategy into action at scale. So the main theme of today's session, it's all about strategic planning. So first, I'm just going to give a high-level overview, kind of talk about some of the challenges that I hear from customers when it comes to strategic planning. Then give a little high-level overview of how Asana does strategic planning. Then I'm going to turn it over to our customer speaker from DIRECTV, and she's going to share a story around how she was able to bring Asana to organization from day one, the challenges she faced, but ultimately how she was able to create a culture of change and really drive changes to their processes. So I know it's been a lot of sitting today, but I kind of like to start all the talks I do with a little interaction. So just a quick show of hands, who here has been halfway through the quarter, you're sitting in a meeting, you're trying to figure out what the team should prioritize, and you've realized, wait a second, what are our plans again? Or do they change? What are we even prioritizing? How should we measuring our impact? Who here has kind of like experienced that type of panic before? Yeah? Okay. I see some hands, some of you might raise your hands. Good job. You don't struggle from the same anxiety as some of us do, so great there. But just in general, I think when it comes to planning, sometimes your priorities don't necessarily align to how teams are prioritizing, or sometimes leaders, they ask for something and you didn't account for it in the meeting minutes, or maybe something's happened in the market and you need to be able to pivot and change accordingly. When we think about the challenges for a lot of our organizations with strategic planning, we can typically boil it down to one of these 5. So first is the inability to turn strategy into action. So maybe you have high-level objectives, you have lofty plans, but when it comes time for the executional teams to actually do the work, there's something that's lost in translation and typically leads to a breakdown in that process. The second is the competition for limited resources. And with this, we think about prioritization. We have too many initiatives we want to staff, but not enough resources, not enough time, not enough budget to be able to accomplish all of it. Third is just general lack of visibility. And so when we typically think of our PMO audience, it's lack of portfolio visibility. So tons of teams, they're doing a lot of great work, but you don't really understand what's the state of the status of their work. Next, we have difficulty measuring impact. And with the difficulty measuring impact, the thing I hear a lot from especially PMO organizations is they're really good at measuring outputs, but they're not really good at measuring outcomes. And so it's really easy to know, did we do this task? Did we do this project? But it's really hard to understand, what was the point? What was the actual impact of putting in all this time and energy into that work? And the last one is just general rigidity around planning processes. So sometimes teams, they have a planning process, but when things change, it's really difficult for them to understand, okay, we need to make changes to our plans. How do we actually make that happen? So one of these 5 challenges, maybe you deal with 1, 2, 3, hopefully not 5, but if you are, that's totally fine. We're going to talk a little bit more about how Asana can solve it. But when we think about these challenges, there's actual real outcomes and real costs to them. So the first and foremost, wasted resources. So if you have a hard time prioritizing, you have a hard time understanding how to turn plans into action, you're probably wasting resources, whether it's as small as a team spinning their wheels, kind of doing the same thing over and over again, to more of a macro problem where people are just broadly, holistically working on the wrong stuff. The second, these challenges can typically lead to information silos. So maybe everyone's using a different tool, and that's what leads to that lack of portfolio visibility. That's what kind of leads to a breakdown in communication because everyone's kind of working in their own world. And as we know, especially with a well-oiled enterprise organization, people need to be able to speak to each other and understand what's going on. But lastly, the most important thing in terms of a poor outcome is just the failed outcomes. We, as professionals, especially in the PMOs, we want to make sure we're driving positive outcomes for our teams. And so when we aren't able to have a very clear strategic planning process, we typically lead to outcomes that just don't really work well for the company. And we don't want any of that. So broadly, Asana, we're here to kind of help teams be able to create a well-oiled strategic planning process. I'm going to walk through kind of how Asana does it at a high level. So when we think about that process, we can think about 3 different stages: setting goals, planning, as well as reporting. And especially as a product marketer, I'm working across many different teams, lots of cross-functional work that's happening. And it's really important for my teams to be able to orient around goals. So goals is very central to Asana's strategic planning process. And the way it starts is it starts with a vision. It starts with high-level objectives. It basically starts with objectives from our executives. And we then document all this into Asana. So typically with a lot of organizations, they might say their objectives. They might have an all hands when they announce it, but unless it's properly documented, it's really difficult for teams to truly understand why the work they're doing is important. And you can see right here, this is an example of our strategy map. So a strategy map is a way to visualize how goals actually align with an entire organization. So anyone, whether you're an executive, whether you're an individual contributor, you can very clearly map that hierarchy. Then once these high-level objectives are set, each team that's responsible for executing, they'll actually go in and create parent and child goals. And again, this is kind of creating more transparency, more accountability with our teams. And here we actually use SMART goals, which leverages AI to not only help with goal formulation, but it'll take a look at all the goals across the organization and make sure teams are using the same language, make sure teams are measuring impact in similar ways. So again, using AI as a way to drive standardization, but also increase accountability, not just within one team, but across all teams. When it comes time to actually kick off the work, that's where portfolios come into play. So portfolios is a way to be able to organize all of your Asana projects, but also your milestones, your tasks, basically every single bit of executional work, having it live within one or many portfolios, especially if you're working on cross-functional teams. And the reason why using portfolios is so important in Asana is because we really lean on our dashboards to understand what's actually happening on our projects. And the really great thing about Asana's reporting is because it lives directly in the tool, in real time, you can fully understand where teams are at. I'm sure many of you here, reporting, status reporting, understanding progress is so important, but maybe you're using another tool to be able to do that translation layer, and you want to, and maybe tools are, maybe some people on your team are actually using different tools to understand what's happening. When you have that gap, there leads to outdated information. Sometimes it leads to someone saying like, hey, this looks up to date maybe yesterday, but what about today? And there is a little bit of extra work your team needs to do to update those numbers. But with Asana, because everything lives in one central place, all in real time, it stays up to date, saving you a lot of time and a lot of back and forth emails, Slacks, or whatever you're using to communicate. The final piece of our reporting cycle is, of course, status reporting. This is, I think, the bane of many PMOs' existence, and later on you're going to hear a little bit more about the status reporting horrors that our customer had to face before she brought Asana to their teams. But with Asana AI, you can actually generate status reports using contextual information in literal seconds. So taking all that time out of actually manually cobbling together updates and just being able to look at what AI presents, making sure it highlights the right impact and uses the language that your teams resonate with the most. So with this kind of setting goals, planning, reporting process, it's really easy for all teams at Asana to be able to understand how their work kind of ladders up from the bottom of the tasks all the way up to the greater mission. So that was kind of our process at a high level, but of course, our work is never done. We're always thinking of new ways to make improvements to our processes. And so I'm actually really excited to share with this group, the first wide audience to share this with, but Asana is actually launching a brand new add-on on November 20th. It's our timesheets and budgets add-on. So this is really helpful for PMO teams, helpful for people who are managing agencies, contractors, basically anyone that needs to manage timesheets, needs to manage billable, non-billable hours, maybe you have different billing rates for different people on your teams, all the way down the project spend. This will now all be fully integrated into Asana. So you can basically use granular time and cost tracking, not just for understanding progress, but to help with forecasting, to help with projecting, and just to really understand the true status of your work. So that way you can deliver more projects on time and also get warning signals when something might be a little off track. So that was all about Asana. And I'm sure some of you here, you're kind of excited. You're like, wow, that seems really cool, but centralized goal setting, we don't even have centralized project management. How do I start from square one? Well, that's why I'm really excited to introduce our customer speaker from today, Keely from DIRECTV. She's going to share a story about how she was able to bring Asana to her company from day one, all the challenges that she faced, how she was able to work with executives, work with different teams to understand processes, and ultimately create a culture of change to be able to drive strategy into action at scale. So with that, I'd like to introduce Keely. Here you go.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Ben. Hi, everybody. My name is Keely Sylvester. I'm a Director of Program Project Management at DIRECTV. At DIRECTV, we've been at the forefront of entertainment for nearly 3 decades, and I'm so excited that I get to be here with y'all today to share a little bit of our journey with Asana. So, there we go. All right, so before we had Asana, we had some key challenges that we needed to address, and this was back before we separated from AT&T. So we were still part of the AT&T broader team. Thanks. And so we had several teams using several different tools and systems to manage their projects. Nothing was really connected. Everybody kind of did their own thing. And this led to 3 key challenges for my team. Number 1, we had people reaching out from all over the place trying to get support for their initiatives. We had multiple intake forms and intake processes going around, and it was very confusing for folks to know which intake form to use to get support from which team. Secondly, it was very hard for anybody, colleagues and leaders alike, to get an understanding of where we stood on the dozens of initiatives that we had going on. We had a siloed approach to project management. We had no portfolios. We had inconsistent access to projects and status updates. We didn't have any templates, and none of our collaboration tools were connected and talking to each other. And then the third pain point that we had was our project status updates. My team was responsible for providing updates on some smaller projects on a weekly basis, and it was painstaking. It took hours. We would have to get on the phone and call PMs. We'd have to sift through emails to get information. And we would be working till 10, 11 o'clock at night just trying to pull together the right nuggets for a status update. And then we would pull that all together, and a lot of times, by the time it got to leadership, it was already outdated. So, when we separated from AT&T, we knew we had to find a better solution. And so that's when we looked into Asana and decided to path forward. Okay, so when we brought on Asana, my team and I brainstormed to determine what were those gaps in our processes and how should we solve them. We knew that we had to come up with a way to centralize and simplify our intake process. We wanted to define how should we manage a project and how should we do our updates, and how can we make that more streamlined and less daunting and less time consuming. So we knew we had to build things from the ground up. So we brought in some professional services with Stand 8. We had them for about 6 months, and we worked with them to create an intake form, to build some workflows, and then they taught us the basics of Asana. One of the first operational wins that we had was in our intake and steering process. We have consolidated intake for 28 teams into one form. So that's pretty impressive. We can service 28 different teams with a single intake form, okay? With that, when an intake comes in into our group, we evaluate that intake to determine if, number 1, is it gonna be a task that we just need to assign to a team? Or is it something that's cross-functional that may need a project manager assigned to it? In tandem with all of that, when we deem an intake, when it comes in and we say, okay, it's gonna be a task, we shoot it off to that team and it's done, right? That team's gonna work their task. If it's a project and it's gonna require a PM, we bring it through our steering process. Our steering process starts with a voting system. Each team that comes to our steering call, they have a vote, and they're gonna vote on the initiative. They're not voting on whether or not they're gonna approve a project, but they're voting in to let us know if they have an impact of that project. So once our steering is complete, the voting is done, we create the project. Anyone who voted in on the project, they're either going to get a task because they have something to do for the project, or they're going to get a project role so that they can remain updated with statuses, meetings, etc. So once our proficiency with Asana grew, we learned more about what was possible, we decided to evolve into broader project management. So in tandem with our steering process, we have automations in place with Asana to where our projects are automatically added to portfolios after that steering process. So we have each senior director in our organization, they have their own portfolio, and then for their team's work, if they want to just see their team stuff, and then we have a broader business operations portfolio where all of the projects bubble up to. On that broader portfolio, we use custom fields to bubble up some information. So we want to organize and surface that information to our leaders as quickly as possible. So we use some custom fields. We have on there things like project category, project team, a general update. So again, this surfaces up that information in a very organized way for our leaders to get a quick view on. And then, of course, our pesky status reports. So these things took, like I said, they were a nightmare before Asana. Now we use Asana Smart Status Updates, and we can do that update in a matter of a couple of clicks in less than 5 minutes. So that's been a huge win for us. So what was the impact of this transformation? Well, we centralized our intake form. That's where we started, and that was amazing. But with that, we saw an 80% increase in the amount of intake volume we were able to handle. And then in addition to that, we now have clear, concise communications on all of our projects, right? Everything's right there in the portfolio, real easy for our leaders to go in and get an update on. And again, our status reports, under 5 minutes now. That saved us at least 150 hours a year. So as you think about what it is you're going to do and how you're going to roll this out potentially to your teams, you really have to think about breaking the old habits and build new norms. So we organized all of our thoughts, we presented it to our leaders, and they bought in completely. So we documented everything into a job aid. We have that job aid posted on a SharePoint site, and we also took the time to do some live trainings with all of our teams. All right, so the key to all of the success that we had is that we treated this as a cultural transformation, not a software update, okay? We met with people, we met with individual teams, we helped them build their workflows, and that gave them ownership. That gave them some skin in the game too, to where they would naturally be owners and champions for their team for Asana. We also didn't stop the conversation there. We held monthly forums with our project management team where we shared tips and tricks and reminders about Asana. But the key to this meeting was not only were we doing that, but we created a genuinely safe space for anybody to ask any question that they had. So the learning has to continue, and you have to continue the dialogue. Something else is you have to really show people what's in it for them, right? By doing these new processes, how is that going to make their job easier? How is that going to save them time and streamline what they're doing? So with all of that, we have created really a great culture of accountability, transparency, and then collaboration. I can tell you that the collaboration on our teams has never been better. The consistency in the way we do things, the consistency on how we share our status updates and our project updates has never been clearer. Our leaders can now make faster, data-driven decisions by what we've done here. So what's next? Well, our job as PMOs is never over. I think we all know that. But as you're working with your teams, you want to make sure that you want to be patient, right? It takes time. When teams discover for themselves what's in it for them, true adoption is going to happen much sooner. Again, what's in it for them? You always want to stress that. And then also that the transformation is going to take work. You can't just publish a job aid, expect people to read it and become a SME, become an expert. That's just not going to happen. Continue the conversation, meet them where they are in their learning, and continue that conversation. All right, as we close out, if you want to explore the AI use cases for PMOs in the demo space, or you want to visit the Innovation Lab or the Innovation booth for an AI maturity consultation. And thank you all so much for letting me come and share our story. Thank you.